2021-es PesText világirodalmi fesztivál nézőit. Én Benedek Márton vagyok, mostani vendégünk pedig Stefan Hertmans belga író, a Háború és Terpentin, illetve a nemrég megjelent A Fordult szív című regény szerzője. Hi Stefan, nice to meet you.
Hello.
So, you have written many things, but so far there are two novels in Hungarian translation by you. First one is War and Turpentine, and second one is The Convert, which has been published this year. Both books are based on your personal experiences and various kinds of archive things. So can we say that these are the things that make a novel a Stefan Hertmans novel?
First, I must say that the first one, War and Turpentine, was for me a change in my literary writing and work. I had never written anything historical. I was, in fact, not interested in historical novels. I have been studying at university at the time of experimental literature. That means we were reading James Joyce and Samuel Beckett and Heiner Müller and the French Nouveau Roman. So I was absolutely not planning to write ever some sort of historical novel. But I knew that somewhere I had the legacy of my grandfather's notebooks, which are really a testimony about the First World War in Flanders, about which so far there were no great novels written. There was somebody who was before me, that's a Flemish writer, Erwin Mortier, who also wrote a book about the First World War. But of course, my book was based on autobiographical elements because it's my grandfather. I lived in the house, as I said in the book. I heard the stories of the First World War every day as a child. So when I started writing this book, I realized I couldn't be in fiction, in pure fiction. On the other hand, I didn't want to be a writer in the tradition of Thomas Mann or Margit Yourcenar or all those traditional historical novels. And I had a sentence in mind of Don DeLillo, which maybe characterizes very well what I do in these novels, that the contemporary writer has become the journalist of his characters. So I'm a character among my characters. I'm not an all-knowing author because I do not believe in that objectivity, you see. There is a historical subjectivity, you could say, which is at stake in these novels. In the first novel, that changed all of my habits of novel writing. And then when I stumbled upon this Jewish story of this proselyte girl in the 11th century, I thought I might do the same. I might be some sort of journalist because she has lived in my own neighborhood and she's something like my neighborhood girl, but 1,000 years ago. So why wouldn't I go after her? And this really coined for me a new form of the novel, which you could call an investigative fiction, right? I've just published in Dutch a third novel, and the three together form a trilogy. The third is called The Ascension. I have lived for 20 years in a house in the old center of Brussels, where apparently an old Nazi has lived for 20 years. So I had to look out the story of this Nazi. And so for the third time, I'm stumbling in a story which in its essence is in fact autobiographical.
I see.
But also requires some imagination and requires damn much research. Because all of those three books demanded 3 years of research and more. So this new form of what I call for myself auto-docu-fiction novels was one great project to write those three.
Okay, but do you agree to the people who compare your work to Sebald's work? Because there are some similarities.
Absolutely, and I'm aware of this, and let's say that I even give myself the ironical hint by playing with old photographs like he does.
Yeah, and you also mentioned him in the War and Turpentine, yeah.
Exactly. I must say that together with Jorge Luis Borges and Nabokov, he's one of my great masters of thinking. And it was in Sebald that for the first time I saw that you can write historical fiction from a very intimate point of view. Because, you know, literature is almost always about the fate of the individual in the light of the collective tragedy. That's a novel. That's what we are doing. That's why the novel is so important for democracy. Because you're always writing from the point of view of somebody alone, an individual, and in the background there's a great history playing. That's why the novel is always political, even it writes about intimate affairs, even it's autobiographical. So this sort of novel to me is a way of giving a tribute to Sebald as well. Some readers ask me, why are the pictures in such gray, black and white? Couldn't you give nice colored pictures? And I say, then the history would be gone. I'm not writing for Hollywood. I'm writing for the history and the philosophical mind of the reader. And the fact that the picture is gray shows the wound of time. And this is, of course, all things I have learned from Sebald.
Okay. So you are a Flemish author in Belgium, and so you came from a multilingual environment, which probably had or has a lot of advantages, but is there any difficulties you met when you started become a writer?
Yeah, certainly, because already when I studied, first of all Belgium is, as maybe most of your readers know, divided in 3 parts, in fact in 4 parts. The Flemish make 60% of the population and live in the north. They speak the same language as the Dutch, but we have a bit of a different accent. We pronounce it much nicer. That's the difference. And you have in the south, you have the Walloons who speak French, right? And who have their own accent of speaking French. At the east side, we have the German-speaking cantons, as we call them, which were given to Belgium after the First World War for the damages and the injustice done to Belgium. And then the fourth is the capital region of Brussels, which is practically international territory, has its own government, its own ministers, its own parliament. So in telling you this, I can say to you, the most difficult, complex democracy in Europe is Belgium. If you then also reckon that the second important language in Brussels is Arabic, you see that we're living in the present. And we're living in a very difficult, complex, but very fascinating present, which has its own problems, but which is very inspiring and emancipating for writers. So we Belgians tend to say, if all Europe could become as tolerant as Belgium, it would be very fine. It would be less problems. Of course, we have our own problem. Now, having said this, we Flemish have always been bilingual. We always automatically studied the second language, which is French. So I did my exams as a boy of 17 in a Flemish school, my exams of French. I had to read Camus and Sartre in French for my exam. So we speak French very well. That is a very good advantage. We have a very nice poet who once said, it's a great advantage to speak a minority language. There is a very large abroad, and you can speak very many languages, while people who speak a majority language, like the French, the Spanish, and the English, they practically never learn second languages. So they don't come out of their bulb. We do. You have to. You're Hungarian, you have to speak other languages. As I know, very many Hungarians of these generations speak English before they spoke German, out of some complex reasons somehow, but there was this culture also. So this mingling and this having many languages playing in your head is for me very important. I read as much as I can of Borges in Spanish. I read it with the Flemish translation because I need the translation. But to hear the language in your head, to hear the music of another language, influences your own literary talent. The more languages you speak, the better you speak your mother tongue.
Okay,
that's the paradox.
So, as you speak many languages, do you work closely with your translators?
Absolutely. Today, for instance, for my third novel, I had a mail of 22 pages with my German translator because she had some 20 pages of questions on small details. I do the same with my French translator and with my English and American translator. I give context to my other translators, but I don't read their languages. But I do as much as I can to participate in the translation. Yeah.
And is there any rivalry between Flemish and Walloon authors? Or you consider the others as friends who work for this same small country?
You could say that the politicians are in constant concurrence and constant polemics. That's the politicians. But the population is doing very well. My son lives in Brussels and he speaks 4 languages. I mean, he's 25. Those people live in an international city. That's the future. But as Flanders and Wallonia did not have cultural, accords, they can not very easily make a program with writers from both sides and have subsidies. Because the Flemish writers will have subsidies from the Flemish side and the French-speaking writers from the Walloon side. So this is always very complex, and we're working very much on this. I happen to go into a festival next week where Walloon writers and Flemish writers will be together in a Belgian festival. But now you should also see that in international festivals, they practically never invite Belgium as a whole. Mm-hmm. Or they invite the Dutch-speaking writers and then we go with Holland. Or they invite the Walloon writers and they go French writers. So it's very seldom that you see a Belgian festival with both sides on a podium. But we're working on it because I think there are very many points that Walloons and Flemish share. Something like a Belgian mentality exists. We're almost 200 years together. So this makes a very special way of thinking, which is in the first place that most of us, when we hear the word nationalism, we begin to laugh. What am I? Am I a Belgian? Am I a Flemish? I'm both. Am I European? Yes, I'm that too. What is on my passport? On my passport is that I'm Belgian. What am I writing in? I'm writing in Flemish, and so on. So this fluidity of identity is a running gag in Belgium, let's say.
Okay, let me get back to your books a bit. When you wrote War and Turpentine and you did your research, have you met something, I mean anything when you, what made you wonder that, why I didn't learn that in school as a child?
Absolutely. And one of the good examples is, for instance, the way we learned about the Crusades. Mm-hmm. It is only doing my research for the convert about this Jewish girl, this Christian girl becoming Jewish, whose husband has been killed in the Crusades, that I started reading the other documents and other testimonies of the 11th century. And there is namely one very important book by a writer, a Lebanese writer living now in Paris, who wrote a book, Les Croisades vues par les Arabes, the Crusades as it has been related by the Arabs. Mm-hmm. And if you see in those documents how the Crusaders have begun, in fact, some sort of never-ending holy war, and you can say that in a way, they have also guilt in provoking the eternal polemics between the Islamic world and the Christian world. Of course, the Muslim world was already expanding. It was in half of Spain. There was a caliphate in Spain. But, for instance, Jewish and Muslim could live very well together there. And there was this concurrency with Christianhood. But what they did in the Far East and in the Middle East was not in the Far East, in the Middle East, I'm sorry, was so outrageous that they started very many of the problems. But you do not read that at school. Mm-hmm. I had to read it in this book of this French author. And then I started reading the old Arabic testimonies, and they give us an all different view on this problem. Of course, I am also true to what our great history writers and historians tell us, but you have always to do your double check. And in doing research for such a large book as The Convert is, because it's a book about all what happened in Europe in the 11th century, and in fact, you can see echoes of our own time. The convert is a refugee. She crosses the Mediterranean in a boat as a woman alone. We do not know what happened to her. I can imagine it, but it is maybe worse than what I described. And what was she fleeing for? Mm-hmm. For what we could call Christian jihadists. There was a terrible radicalism in that time too, from the Christian side. So, starting from this, I learned all sorts of things. For instance, when you let her pass in the 11th century, the Mediterranean, you have to read a book about the ships of that time. What were the naval routes in those days? When they are sleeping in the woods under the stars because they are fleeing for her father. Did they have anything against the mosquitoes? Did they have bombs or anything? Yes, they had, but you have to study books to know what was the apothecary of the time, and so on. So writing that sort of book learns me a lot of things that I could never learn at school, that's sure.
And I got a sense that Marseille and Cairo maybe preserved something what they were like 1,000 years ago, but maybe I'm not right. But I got this sense from your book. And as you traveled a lot and you were the same places as your character, that's my question.
What is the question exactly?
Is Marseille and Cairo could preserve something from what they were 1,000 years ago?
There might be some things. Marseille, for instance, is still a city which is completely different from the rest of France. It has been founded by Greek and Near East sailors and was called Massilia. And it is still a city which has something African. It is already a bit Eastern if you see it, and that's very fascinating because at the same time it belongs to the French Republic. So I always like to see and feel the complex underlayers of a culture, what is still there of an old culture. Do you see traces of it? And of course in Marseille you can see a lot of traces, but not necessarily traces of the 11th century, that's too long ago. So as I tell in the book, there are 3 places where I thought, here I touch a stone which was there at the time of Hamutal, but there are not many places. And the most fascinating thing was, of course, that I discovered in my small village in Provence, behind the Mont Ventoux, that I discovered in the rocks an old mikveh, an old Jewish bath, and the ruins of an old synagogue, which is probably for the first time that we see traces of Jewish inhabitants in small villages. Because we know very well the history of the Jews, who were very important, culturally speaking, in the south of France in the 11th century. They had great synagogues in Avignon, in Carpentras, great cities. But we didn't know anything about the villages. So this is a bit sensational about what I found in my village. Thanks to a manuscript which was found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which is now in Cambridge, of which there are other theories in Tel Aviv, and it was elucidated by a professor in Chicago. And all of this, of course, of a question I was asking myself in a small village in Provence. So it's all over the planet, and at the same time, it's just about one girl.
Thank you, Stefan Hertmans, for being here with us. Thank you.
It was my pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Kedves nézőink, ez volt a beszélgetésünk Stefan Hertmansszal. Keressék fel további programjainkat a PesText Fesztiválon. Viszontlátásra!